We got a caller. I think it was, Steve, was it a call or a live chat? Do you remember the person that was calling in?
It was a caller, and I ended up eventually jumping on the phone with this guy because he was using a word that none of us knew. And I remember the screener kind of putting the phone down and saying, hey, does anyone know what a lodger is? And then it sort of worked its way around the office, and then it piqued my interest, and I said, no, what is a lodger? And then I ended up getting on the phone and getting a good education from the landlord on exactly what he was speaking about. So he sort of came up with this idea that there is a landlord vernacular. There's a set of vocabulary words or terms that should be familiar to landlords. Some of them are used more often than others, but these are definitely common words that landlords may know the definitions to or understand the definitions to, and the average Joe off the street probably doesn't, and it has no reason to, most likely. 2, 3, 4.
Welcome to the RentPrep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
Yeah, the first one that you got on your list is Fixture. And I know most landlords are going to jump right out and say, I know what a fixture is. But in terms of tenancy, fixture actually has a slightly different meaning. So in the case when you're dealing with a tenant, a fixture can be something that a tenant makes part of the property. The example that I think that we had found here was the tenant installs a custom double pane window that, eventually they install that and put that into the property, whether they got permission or not. But now that becomes a part of the property. That's a fixture of the property. And it does not mean they can take that when they move. That means that is part of the property. And even if it came out of their pocket, if it wasn't something that they got approval for or went through the right channels to have installed, or you had no knowledge as the landlord that it was being installed, it's an improvement to the property that belongs to stay there even after they're gone.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point too, because if a tenant's asking to make some improvements to the property, that's something you want to think about. Is this going to be a permanent type thing, or is there something that they could take with them when they go? So probably having good communication at that point too with the tenant, because I'm sure there's been instances where a tenant's tried to take something with them and the landlord's like, wait a minute, that stays here. That's part of the property. So it's definitely good to understand what a fixture is and make sure the tenant understands what it is and make sure you're on the same page.
For sure. A pretty good example is I remember talking with a landlord who was explaining to me that the tenants basically finished a basement of a rental property. And the landlord had no knowledge of it. And it obviously cost thousands of dollars to finish this basement. And, on one hand, that's great. You got a tenant who really feels at home. They're making the property, they're really digging their heels in if they're doing some major improvements like that. But they ended up doing this basement and making it beautiful. And then they ended up leaving, and they wanted to rip everything down and take the materials with them as if they were going to finish a basement somewhere else and use the same material.
And hopefully all that drywall just fits the same way in the next basement. And
right.
All the cuts to work out perfectly for them.
Right. In this case, the landlord had sort of the mentality of like, well, it wasn't there when they were there.
Well, I feel like I shouldn't tell this story, but I'm going to. So I kind of actually ran into this issue with a landlord. So I had moved in with my girlfriend, who is now my wife. So, it was fine that I moved in case you're listening, Mom. But yeah, I might have felt like that a little. But we had a miscommunication with her landlord. So I had moved out of my place because I had a couple of roommates and I was tired of living with them. So I moved in with her, and I asked, if we could make a couple improvements. And those improvements were painting the door that was white, but it was starting to bleed through, so it was pink. It was pretty early in the relationship. I think I was trying to prove to her that I was useful so she would keep me around. It worked. And we wanted to just put a dimmer switch into the dining room just because we thought it would, make the lighting a little bit better in there. And I also just kind of caulked one of the windows because the pane was loose. It was actually plastic, and it was letting in a lot of cold air. So got permission from the landlord to do this. She said to just take the cost of the supplies out of the rent. Because, one of them was just a cold, drafty window. I'm kind of fixing that for her. And then when rent came due, she got upset. And she said, I thought about it more, and I don't feel comfortable with you guys doing improvements to the rental property. And if she had told me that from the get-go, I would have been absolutely fine with it. But I was like, well, you told me, it was fine.
This was after you deducted it from the rent.
Yeah, and it wasn't much. I mean, we're talking like $40, worth of stuff. But she said no, she wasn't comfortable with it. And, I'm feeling kind of taken because I'm like, all right, I just improved this property. And I thought we were on a, good communication here. And I think what happened was her son got involved, and son was like, "What are you doing? Like, you don't want this happening, conspiracy theory, whatever." I actually knew her son, played on a two-hand touch football team with them, which was kind of awkward after that. But it was just one of those things. When I left, I was like, I kind of want to just take that like light switch out of spite.
Right.
Yeah.
Another good example that I can think of, a conversation that I've had with a landlord, was a guy down in Florida who was a renter, and he was an electrician. And he had apparently made his own assessment that the property that he was renting wasn't good, in terms of like the electrical work. He did all the electrical work, apparently like installed a new fuse panel, everything, like redid all the stuff, and then basically sent the landlord the bill. It was like, here you go.
Yeah.
It's definitely an extreme situation there. But as a landlord, I think it's definitely important to make clear, like your landlord didn't make very clear. You can't be wishy-washy or flip-flop. It's one way or the other, or it's yes or a no. And it's something that you should have already thought of, right? Ideally, you should have it in your lease. Yeah. Whether or not improvements are acceptable, your lease should probably say as a staple, no, they're not acceptable. And then, if you want to approve small items on a case-by-case basis, like in your case where you're fixing a window or you're repainting a door, fine. But as a general rule of thumb, don't make improvements.
Well, I also did put a jacuzzi tub in the bedroom. And I didn't think a big thing of, I didn't think it'd be a big deal, but it started leaking all over the place. There was, a lot of flood damage, right. But I think she blew it out of proportion.
Right.
It wasn't my fault.
She's the one that's unreasonable.
Yeah, it's always the other person's fault.
Right.
That's what we found. So we should probably move forward because that's only one of the 10. So we'll get it moving here. I think the next two actually go together. So we're looking at quiet enjoyment. Now, this one's pretty self-explanatory, but basically a tenant's implied right to the enjoyment and use of a rental property without obstruction or intrusion from other building residents, the landlord, or other persons. So basically, it's like protecting the tenant so that you, the landlord, just can't like barge into their apartment without any kind of notice or anything like that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of landlords rightfully use this as somewhat of a catch-all, right, to deal with annoyances or to deal with tenants that are creating problems or noise complaints or a dog that's consistently barking or, whatever the case may be. If you end up having to remove that person, a lot of landlords are using quiet enjoyment as the reasoning, saying, listen, I have a responsibility to all the other tenants in this building to provide them quiet enjoyment, and you're ruining this, So yeah. I definitely see that being used quite a bit.
Okay.
In terms of you mentioned that these two kind of go together. Where the next one is right of entry, and that sort of ties into quiet enjoyment when we mentioned without obstruction or intrusion from the landlord. Right, the landlord. It's something that we definitely hear a lot. Where some landlords are a little bit too involved, a little bit too concerned. They don't have a standard, acknowledgement of how often they're going to come and do an inspection. Mm-hmm. So some landlords will do it annually. Some landlords pass it off as a maintenance inspection.
Yep.
But realistically, they're going in and they're looking at the property and making sure that nothing's damaged or too far gone. You know, it's a good idea to get in there periodically so you can catch stuff before it gets too far gone, or you can catch a problem before it turns into a bigger problem.
Yeah, people listening, if you've listened to other episodes, you may have heard us talk about the RentPrep for Landlords Facebook group. And that's something that comes up in there quite a bit that I've seen where people, it seems like 90 days is a lot. Is a lot of times the amount of time that people do a checkup at. And I like the fact that some of the landlords, like you said, they kind of mask it as, doing maintenance. The one phrased it as like, I check the drains to make sure the drains are moving fine, because you don't know if you have hair clogs or stuff like that. But really, you're just going in 90 days, making sure the tenant's not, doesn't have a grow house or a meth lab or, maybe just doing damage to the property. And that's a good practice to have in place because, they're going to screw up. They'll probably do it in the first 90 days anyways.
Yeah. And I know that, I've definitely seen my share of forms that have like an annual maintenance checklist. So the landlord, you have some sort of document or a paper that you can go in, follow along, and you're checking, different, like you mentioned, drains, lighting, all those things. And then at the end, they're signing off. And this is just another tool to be able to use to say, hey, when I was here on May 1st, this was in great shape, and now it's not. Or, it's a way to document things falling apart eventually, or normal wear and tear and what's not normal wear and tear. But right of entry for landlords can get kind of sticky. The biggest key takeaway is you have to give proper notice. You have to.
Unless you're in Idaho, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't that the state where like the landlord doesn't need to give any kind of forewarning, like no 24-hour rule, which is really weird.
Right. Even in those cases, you're going to avoid a potential problem by just giving the courtesy of saying, hey, I'm going to be dropping by at this time, or if you're in a state that requires a certain notice, a 24-hour notice, or some states are really particular on the hours that you can come and visit the property. So just make sure that you know your own state's rules of what the landlord's right to entry is, and it's always a good idea to take the proper steps of good documentation and proper notice.
Steve, you want to, in 50 seconds or less, tell us what a security deposit is. Because now that I'm looking at it on this list, I'm like, you know what? I'm pretty sure everybody knows this one. Do you got any tips on that?
No, I mean, security deposit, I will say, if I got 50 seconds here, security deposit is the number one reason somebody goes to landlord-tenant court. It's the number one cause of any complaint. So make sure that you are very, very clear in your lease exactly how the security deposit works. What would be taken out, what would constitute to be taken out of the security deposit, and you make sure that you're documenting everything perfectly when it does come time to return that security deposit money to them, especially if it's less anything because of damages or anything that needed to be removed from that security deposit. There's a form called a SOTA form, which is a security deposit
disposition, is it?
Yeah. So, and what that does is it just allows you to list what you're subtracting from the security deposit. So after you go in, they've moved out, you do your walkthrough and make sure you're documenting really well and say, okay, there was a hole kicked in the wall in the bedroom. It's going to cost me $150 to fix, and that's going to be removed and taken off of the security deposit. So as long as you're keeping really good track of that, and always think of it in terms of what happens if things blow up and everything goes wrong. How are you going to prove in court that you did the right thing? So have that in the back of your mind.
So like many things, document.
Yep. Yes.
Find a system for you for documenting things and stick to it and make sure you're doing it. It'll help you out in the long run, help you sleep easier.
Yeah.
So.
Take pictures.
Yeah.
Because again, you're going to have to present this to another human being that you hope is reasonable. And whether it be a judge or an arbitrator or whoever it is, that you can present your information and say, there shouldn't be a conversation. This is an easy reason why I didn't give this person their full security deposit back.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
The next term we're looking at here is subletting, and I put it on here just because I saw that it said or assignment. If I heard assignment, to be honest, I would have not been too familiar with that. But most people are familiar with subletting, which is where the tenant has the right to sublease or assign the property. But a couple things to keep in mind is under a sublet, the original tenant is still responsible for honoring the provisions in the lease. So just because you're subletting and that person comes in and that other tenant comes in and maybe does some damage, maybe they're the one that kicked that hole in the bedroom wall you spoke of. It's the original tenant that's still on the lease. So it can get probably a sticky situation if you got tenants that are subletting. Make sure they understand what the rights are, what the expectations are in that situation if you're willing to let a tenant sublet.
No doubt. And I think the majority of the issues arise from tenants not being aware that that is the case, that they're still responsible. They're the one that's on the lease. And I think a lot of them do it without the landlord knowing. And so it's definitely important for the landlord to think ahead, have something in your lease. If you want to allow subletting, I would highly recommend that the landlord still be a part of the screening process. You know, don't let the Don't let your existing tenant handle that part of the leasing and say, okay, you pick the guy and hopefully he's good and I'll just have to deal with it.
Sure.
So that landlord should maintain some sort of control over that situation and say, cool, if you want to sublease, that's fine. I'm okay with that. But I get to pick who you're subleasing to and I get ultimate say and have the ability to run the background checks on them.
So I'm going to jump in here. We try to keep all the episodes. We're going to try to keep them to like 15, 20 minutes around there. And this episode is getting a little bit long, guys. We got 5 more terms to discuss. So if you tune in next week, we're going to be discussing the next 5 terms, and we'll also get to what a lodger is. Thanks for tuning in. And of course, join us in the discussion on Facebook at RentPrep for Landlords. Request access to that group, and we'll get you in. And we look forward to hearing from you.